Hey, welcome back to Zombie Tactics. Today I'm wading into a subject that I honestly never thought I'd talk about on any of my videos. However, a couple of people asked me to do this. They asked for my opinion on this subject. I'm not exactly sure why they respect my opinion, but I'm kind of doing this for them as much as anything else. So the subject is, do 1911s suck as pistols? And it's, I think, prompted by a couple of videos that have come out recently from James Yeager and Rob Pincus, where they offer the opinion variously that either in Yeager's case, well, yeah, 1911s kind of suck for, his use case or the way that he likes to operate a pistol. And Rob Pincus has actually issued forth a challenge that if anybody can bring a 1911 to one of his classes and run it through the whole class without having some kind of malfunction, because of the design of the 1911, well, then he'll pay for the class and he'll pay for the ammunition that the person used during that class as well. So those are pretty provocative ideas to be put out there for something that's considered such a classic design as the 1911. The 1911 is certainly the most popular and successful pistol design ever in the history of firearms, probably closely followed by the Glock, if the Glock hasn't surpassed it a little bit then. So I'm going to weigh in with a few opinions about this, and as I do with a lot of things, I research them to death because I'm kind of a research wonk, and that's where my opinion comes from. It doesn't come from mostly my experience having been in classes and training in an inordinate amount and things like that, although I've been in a few handgun classes, several dozen, and I've certainly witnessed my share of 1911s failing to make it through any kind of a hard driving class. To put my perspective, put my opinion in perspective, I don't currently own a 1911 pistol. I think they're beautiful handguns, given that you use them and operate them and maintain them in a particular kind of way. They don't fit my particular needs or wants, so I don't see any reason why I should spend what, for me, because I want to buy a very good quality 1911 pistol, what would for me would probably be something that cost about $1,000, and I'd have to put several more $100s into it to get it kind of smithed and put together the way that I want it. I'm drawing from various sources, aside from my own personal experience with shooting 1911s, although I don't own one. Some information comes from Dean Caputo's 1911 Armorer's Bench video from Panteo Productions. Some other information comes from this book, which is the Illustrated Encyclopedia of Pistols, Revolvers, and Submachine Guns. It's really not so much an encyclopedia as it is a coffee table book, but it's mostly accurate in most of the things that I've been able to verify in here for the 1911, so that's a pretty good source of information. I've also read all the stuff on various articles on Wikipedia and gun magazines and everything that you might see on the subject. And I know quite a few people who own 1911s as well and are aficionados of that pistol design. So that's kind of where all this is coming from. So the 1911, does it suck? Well, the first thing we have to do is kind of deconstruct the history of the 1911 and put it in its proper perspective, because perspective on these kinds of questions is everything. You can't just make a determination based on some kind of general information. You can't, for instance, say, well, does a Toyota Corolla suck as an automobile? Well, if the perspective that you want to take a look at that in is you're looking for a very fast, extremely well, good performing, fast sports car, well, a Toyota Corolla is not the right car for you. You go out and you buy yourself some Italian sports car that's finely machined and must be maintained in a particular way. It's going to drive great, it's going to handle great, it's going to go fast. And so, you got to keep in mind what it is that you're talking about. Do you want a sports car? Do you want a commuter car? Same thing happens with guns a lot. So the history of the 1911, we need to demystify a little bit to put the 1911 in its proper perspective. Now, the popular mythology of the 1911 goes something like this. John Moses Browning was a genius. By the way, that's not a myth in my opinion. John Moses Browning was a genius. You can't take a look at all the guns that man's designed that are classic designs and come up with any other conclusion. But the myth goes he was a genius and he came up with the 1911 pistol all on his own. It was a totally revolutionary, totally original design. Nothing had ever been made like it before. It was perfect from day one. The military adopted it. It's a one-shot stop man killer because it uses the .45 ACP round, which is the most wonderful handgun round ever made. And the military used it all the way up until politics required them to buy a pistol from another from other people in NATO, so they had to go to the 9mm round, and that's the reason why they dropped the 1911 pistol. Otherwise, they'd be using it today because it's the greatest gun, greatest handgun ever made. Everybody knows it. Everybody who knows anything knows that, and anybody who thinks anything other than that is an idiot. That's the mythology of the 1911 pistol. The truth of it is a little different. The truth of it is that John Moses Browning had been working on what finally became the 1911 pistol for quite some time. There were a number of guns that he had made that were kind of similar to that design, and there were a number of guns that other people had made in the world that were similar to that design as well. And there probably isn't any real design element in the 1911 that's a 100% original design to John Browning. They're more like evolutionary refinements that finally took place in a way that brought the 1911 design together. Certainly since about the 1890s, people have been experimenting with all kinds of similar designs. The big problem with all of them was that they weren't very reliable. And the 1911 was the first semi-automatic pistol design to come out that was, at least for the times, it was a reliable design, a very reliable design, far more reliable than things like the Luger, that was a competing design. The Luger had quite a few problems because it had a very open design. Things could get in the action and crud it up and do all kinds of stuff to it that made it not very useful as a combat pistol. Well, the 1911 comes out, and it seems like all of these issues have been more or less worked out. The U.S. Army adopted it because it was the most reliable auto pistol ever made. Very reliable compared not only to other semi-automatic pistols, but also very reliable compared to the combat revolvers that they were using in the day, which had a tendency that if they got dropped in mud and gook, there was no way you could disassemble them and reassemble them in the field or clean them in the field to put them back into operation. The 1911, you could do almost everything you needed to do with that gun in the field and get it back into operation no matter what happened to it. It had so many field replaceable parts that you didn't have to go back to some garrison level gunsmith type of work. An armorer or most of the guys in a unit that would have been carried in 1911, they would have known what to do with it. Somebody would have had some basic training with the gun and known how to fix it. So that was a big deal. It was not only better than the semi-automatic pistols that were available at the time, it was better than the revolvers of the time in terms of its combat reliability, and that's why the U.S. military adopted it. And that's kind of a theme that we're going to approach. That reliability thing and the ability to take that kind of abuse in the field was the thing that made the 1911 a popular design in the first place. But let's keep that in mind. When we're talking about abuse in the field, we're talking about compared to everything else that was available at the time. And the 1911 was more reliable than every other semi-automatic pistol that was available at the time. That's why the U.S. military adopted it. The mythology kind of has it that we kind of fast forward, and we get into the 80s, and that even though the 1911 is the most perfect pistol ever made, that somehow for political reasons we decided to go with the 9mm round and drop the 45, and we dropped the 1911 at the same time and went with the Beretta M9, and we did that mostly for political reasons. Actually, it wasn't mostly political reasons. It really was that even at that time they were starting to figure out that the 9mm round really did pretty much the same job as the 45 did, and that particularly Europeans wanted a gun that held more rounds, and they wanted a gun that held more rounds because they'd already gotten familiar with guns that they were using that held 13, 14, 15 rounds in a magazine as opposed to the 7 or 8 that a 1911 would hold. It had also come to pass that by the time the 80s came around, there was a bunch of history that had gone on with the 1911 already, and the 1911 was no longer the most reliable gun compared to everything else that was on the market at the time. As reliable as the 1911 was compared to everything else in 1911 and 1921 and 1927, and through all the various modifications that the 1911 went through, it simply couldn't stack up to all the modern gun designs that were available in the 80s. It's part of the reason why the military decided to kind of rethink things, and it's part of the reason why they went with the Beretta M9. All controversy aside, that really is the reason. It was a question of reliability and the fact that the military wanted to have a gun that held more rounds because the Europeans wanted it. That was probably the only political factor, was most of the European members of NATO really wanted a high-capacity gun as opposed to something with only 8 or 9 rounds in it. So reliability is actually the thing that cost the 1911 its contract with the military to provide all the military pistols for NATO. it turned out to not be as reliable compared to everything in the 80s as it was in the 1911s. Kind of a little bit of repetition there, but I want to make that point clear, that that really was the issue. Now, we've had some things happen since then. It's been, a few decades since the 1980s, and things like Glock pistols and other polymer designs and other modern striker fire designs have come out since then. And in a general sense, those polymer designs are actually more reliable than things like the Beretta M9 or similar designs. And for similar reasons. The Beretta similar reasons to why the 1911 bested out the Luger in the first place. The Beretta has an open slide design that allows Gook to get in there and everything else like that. So it's probably not as reliable in the field as a Glock, which has fewer moving parts and more of a closed design, and you can pretty much rattle the thing around and stick it in a bucket of water and wash it, and the thing will continue to work. That's why a lot of militaries around the world have opted to not go with the Beretta. They've decided to go with something like a Glock or some other design that is more reliable. Reliability does have a lot to do with this. So if I've lost you already in this because you're already thinking I'm saying, oh, the 1911 is an unreliable gun, let's put this further in context, because I don't think the 1911 is fundamentally a sucky pistol or a bad gun. And part of the reason why I don't think that is because there are still people who swear by it, who know what they're talking about, and would choose another gun if there was another gun out there that they liked better for whatever reason. And these, in some cases, are people like SWAT teams and other, high speed, low drag entry units of the military, SWAT team, like I said, SWAT teams, entry teams, special forces teams, things like that, who still choose the 1911 as their combat sidearm. But we need to put that in context. We need to put this in a certain kind of context to talk about why somebody like a James Yeager might say the 1911 sucks, and somebody like a Rob Pincus would say, well, I've never seen one get through a course of mine without failing. See, all that information is true. Those special forces guys want that gun. They want that 1911 because that's their favorite gun. And Yeager is actually kind of right, and Pincus observes what he observes, that he hasn't had a 1911 go through a course without having a problem. And frankly, I've seen a lot of those things fail in courses as well. Certainly more 1911s than anything else. It has to do with how you're going to use the gun. Now, I think that for the most part, when somebody like a Yeager or a Pincus is talking, they're talking about two different use patterns, and there's a third one that really applies best to the 1911. The use pattern that somebody like a Yeager or a Pincus would be applying to would be either a duty weapon for a police officer or a self-defense gun for a citizen carrying a gun legally, or in Yeager's case, maybe a little bit more thinking along the lines of a high-risk civilian contractor, somebody like that who's working for a company over in the sandbox somewhere as an adjunct to the military contractor type role. And in both of those cases, they do not necessarily have access or continual access to a few things. One of them is, in the case of a duty gun or a citizen using that gun for self-defense, that gun is their primary weapon. That pistol is the primary weapon of a highway patrol officer. It is the primary weapon of a police officer riding around in a patrol car or on a motorcycle. It's going to be the primary weapon of a citizen for self-defense. It's the only gun they have, so it damn well has to work 100% of the time perfectly. And in a case of somebody like Yeager, my guess, and he could confirm this or not that he has any responsibility to do so, I think it's that, well, you're a civilian contractor out in the field, or you're out with a military unit out in the field, where you may be far afield from supply lines and the abilities to get involved in doing a lot of repair and a lot of modifications on things, or taking things apart and putting them back together. You need something that just plain works all the time with minimal fuss. Well, for something like that, a Glock or one of the other polymer designs is a better idea than the 1911. It just plain is. It's going to last better in those roles. It's going to be more reliable and require less futzing around with the gun to keep it in good shape than a 1911 would, because of the inherent design of the gun. So why is the 1911 chosen by these high-speed units like SWAT teams and stuff like that? Well, part of that has to do with the fact that, first of all, for them, their sidearm, their pistol, is a secondary or tertiary weapon system, meaning that it's the second or the third thing they're going to go to. They've got something like, in the case of a SWAT team or a military squad or a contractor type situation, they've got a primary long arm. They've got a an AK-47, they've got an M16, they've got something that's a long arm, maybe a submachine gun that's their primary weapon, and most of the time that thing's going to work just fine. So most of the time they're not going to that pistol. The only time they go to that pistol is when something is really sucky and has gone wrong with their primary arm. So in their context of use, that gun doesn't necessarily have to live up to the reliability standards of something that's being used all the time and is being used outside of an ordinary supply line. The second part of this comes to the idea that what these units are looking for is a very, very specialist pistol. It's an expert's gun. The 1911 has a great trigger on it, and it's inherently an easy gun to shoot because the weight of an all-metal frame and all of that good stuff. The trigger's gorgeous. They're great guns to shoot. If you haven't shot a 1911, rent one at a range, even a rental gun that's not in such great condition, you'll see this difference. It's just a better shooting gun. Now, because a high-speed unit like a SWAT team or these kind of units in the military that they will fly into an area, drop down out of a helicopter, go in, do their business, and then they're out. They're not out in the field for weeks and months at a time. It doesn't matter that the 1911 is a design that's going to require a lot more gunsmithing and armoring, and something always needs to be tuned, and this spring's a little off, and oh dang, my magazines aren't the great ones. I just bought these, I'm going to go to Wilson Combat ones instead, and those don't really last as long as magazines do on other guns and all this. You have a lot more access to armorer level and gunsmith level ability to have things modified, fixed, tweaked to your liking. And that's exactly what happens in these cases. There's a lot of work that goes into taking a gun, a 1911, and making it something that's suitable for concealed carry or duty use. I know a school that is a very big proponent of the 1911, but even in their own classroom manual, they'll say, well, the best gun ever made is the 1911. If you're going to get a 1911 and carry it, you've made a great choice, but here's all the things that you got to do to it. And they mention this, that even if you buy a really expensive gun that has all these kinds of things already done to it, you're going to have to pay for it one way or the other. You're going to have to get a 1911, and you're going to have this thing chamfered, and you're going to have this tolerance spec, you're going to have this thing done, this thing to it, and another thing to this to it, and make sure the guy checks that, and bevels this, and polishes that, and blah, blah, blah. And then after you do all of that, make sure that you try about 4 or 5 different kinds of duty ammo, and see which one works perfectly well with your gun, because 1911s don't work equally well with all ammo. Once you've done that, you're going to have a great operating gun. And keep in mind, there are people that love the 1911, but they'll also turn right around and say, or if you don't want to go to all that trouble, just buy yourself a Glock. There's a clue here. The clue is that the 1911 can be an excellent, excellent gun. Perfect for just about anything you want to use it for, if you're willing to put the effort into maintaining it and having it tweaked and making sure that all of that stuff gets done right. You can go out and you can buy yourself a nice Nighthawk or something like that that's $2,000, and maybe it has all that stuff done to it, and maybe even going out and after buying that Les Brown or that I almost said Ed Wood, buying that Nighthawk or whatever, I'm getting my metaphors mixed up here, but buying that high-quality 1911 pistol that will cost you several $1,000s, you may still have ongoing maintenance with that gun to keep it up to snuff. That doesn't mean there's something wrong with that gun. It means that if that's not the thing that's not the kind of commitment you're willing to make, that maybe the 1911 isn't the gun for you. You can go right out and you can buy yourself, my opinion, you can go out and buy yourself a Glock, an XD, a Springfield XD, Smith & Wesson M&P, Ruger SR series, a whole bunch of other guns, and they're going to be pretty much good to go right out of the box. About all you might have to do is take them out of the box, clean them to get a little bit of the packing grease out, and that gun will go forever with minimal maintenance. There's a instructor out at Front Sight that has, I think, something like 250,000 rounds, 250,000 rounds through a Glock pistol, a Glock 17, I think in this case, without ever even having cleaned it. And the gun still shoots. It shoots accurately. It shoots reliably. It doesn't have all these malfunctions and everything like that. You're never going to get anything like that to happen with a 1911. That gun's going to have to be cleaned and maintained regularly in order to keep it up to snuff. So it's not so much a question that the 1911 sucks in a general sense. It's a question that the 1911 sucks if what you want to do is just buy a gun and go out and shoot it and have it work for you as a self-defense gun. The 1911 is a perfectly fine pistol if you are willing to take the time and the effort and put the money into it, just as if you bought a Ferrari, you're going to have to put more money into that Ferrari to keep it operating well than you would that Toyota Corolla. It's not a question of being able to compare the two things directly. You have to take a look at the use case. My opinion is for general use, a police officer, duty use, self-defense, that kind of thing, something like a Glock or another modern polymer striker-fired pistol is a far superior choice to a 1911 because you don't have to do all that stuff to it. If you have the money and the time to do all that stuff to it, go for it. The 1911 is a great choice. So, does the 1911 suck? It's really a question of you and what you're willing to put into it in terms of having the gun that works right for you. That's my 2 cents on the issue, maybe even just 1.5 cents. That's Zombie Tactics for today, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.